beautiful young woman who sang Oceans is related to me. You see, her mother is very beautiful and talented, so it's in the genes. That's my daughter Haley, who's a senior in high school. And so we're right in the middle now of trying to think through college decisions, and I just keep asking myself, how did we get here? The time goes so fast, but I'm so proud of her, and thank you, Haley, for sharing that. But I'm also pleased to be here with the rest of my family. We have 3 generations of Crows here today. I have my mom and dad, George and Rosemary, we're all from the Katy, Texas area near Houston. We have my brother Bill, and then we have my family, my wife Tracy, Haley, who you saw sing, and then my daughter, 15-year-old daughter Chelsea, and 10-year-old Sam. Sam, wave around, say hi to everybody, Sam. Now, Sam is sort of a minor celebrity where we live. You know, like someone who goes on the Dancing with the Stars show, he's about that level of celebrity. He really is. You have to make sure you meet Sam. He's known everywhere he goes. I wanted to mention, too, that you probably noticed on the schedule that I'm filling in for Aaron Dean. And actually, that change was made a while back. But as it turns out, I think this was mentioned the other night, but Aaron, of course, has had a medical issue and wasn't able to be here. So please keep him in your prayers. But the reports that I'm getting is that he's doing very well. And there's even some hope he might make it out for part of the feast. That's not a certainty, but we can keep that in our prayers. And, of course, he's with United Church of God and just a fine man. In fact, my wife Tracy and I got to know he and his wife Michelle quite well during college. He was our class advisor, so we spent a lot of time with them. And I'm sorry you're not going to be able to get to hear him speak, but hopefully he'll be here and you can hear him tell some stories of. He's got a lot to tell. Just ask him about some of the days when he was working with Mr. Armstrong, and he'll be happy to share the stories. It's quite interesting. Let's turn to Leviticus 23. And if you start to doze off, I won't take it personally. I really won't. Now, I can't promise I won't call you out from the pulpit, but I won't take it personally, okay? So we'll leave it at that. Leviticus 23, well, this is, of course, the Holy Day chapter. And let's begin in... we'll just read verses 34 and 35, and then we'll skip down to verses 41 through 43. We'll begin in verse 34, Leviticus 23. And the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, The 15th day of the 7th month shall be a feast of tabernacles for 7 days unto the Lord. And on the first day shall be a holy convocation, and you shall do no servile work. So that's, of course, we're here today observing that. But then let's skip down to verse 41 and look at something interesting. It says, And you shall keep it as a feast unto the Lord 7 days, verse 41, in the year, and it shall be a statute forever in all your generations, and you shall celebrate it in the 7th month. And you shall dwell in booths 7 days, you who are Israelite born shall dwell in booths, that your generations may know that I made the children of Israel to dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt, and that I am the Lord your God. So, of course, we understand that this is part of what we're doing. We're living in temporary dwellings during this time. And it brings to mind something that's it's somewhat a regular occurrence, unfortunately, for those of live in Houston, and that is that we are asked to leave our homes periodically to evacuate for hurricanes. And there's some analogies there because it's an inconvenience in many ways, and we're asked to leave. And it usually begins with the mayor or the governor coming on to the television and saying, this is the real deal, this is a big storm, please evacuate. And at the time that I've lived in Houston, that's happened actually 3 times. There was Hurricane Rita in 2005, there was Hurricane Ike in 2008, and of course there was Hurricane Harvey just last year. Just as an aside, anyone here displaced from Hurricane Florence? Anyone here? No? Okay, some in the back. And what's interesting about hurricanes, unlike other natural disasters, is that you have an opportunity to leave your home. Unlike other natural disasters, and I've been in an earthquake one time, living in California. In fact, Kevin, the Kennedys remember the Whittier earthquake in 1987. I was there for that, and that was quite an experience. I've been near tornadoes, but what's unique about hurricanes is that there's a big window usually of time when you can make a decision whether or not to leave. What I always find interesting in these situations is the number of people, despite the pleadings from the governor or the mayor or whatever government officials, the number of people who choose not to leave. Now, in all fairness, there's often good reasons for that. Sometimes people are very well prepared, or maybe they understand the weather forecast and they make a very rational decision not to leave. I'm not talking about that. Or maybe someone just doesn't have the means to evacuate. Maybe they're elderly, don't have the means for whatever reason. So there are reasons people don't leave. But I heard some statistics, like in Florence, someone said maybe 40%, only 40% of the people left. So something like that. So there's a large number of people who woulda, coulda, and shoulda, as they say, leave, and chose not to. I always find that interesting, and I don't know for sure. I don't presume to understand all motivations, but I have a feeling that at least in some cases, the motivation is very simple. The thought of leaving home, leaving their possessions, is just too painful. That's just too scary a thought to leave their possessions, to leave their home. Some of you may know I'm an attorney. Don't hold that against me. I do real estate deals. I'm one of those kind. And once in a while when I'm complaining about the rigors and the stress of my job, which I shouldn't, but I do sometimes. I can't complain, but sometimes I still do, as the old song goes. Someone will say, well, it could be worse. You could be a doctor. You know, at least if you make a mistake, someone loses money. If you're a doctor, you make a mistake, someone might die. I says, but you don't know my clients. Some of them would rather be dead than lose their money. Now, those are rare birds, in all fairness, but they exist. But I can tell you firsthand, there are people that are not too far from that. And by extension, there are some, apparently, that would almost rather risk death. I probably wouldn't put it that way. They'd rather die, but at least rather risk death than leave their home. And it's an interesting dynamic. It's not easy for people to leave their home. One of the great heroes of our faith was asked to make this decision. Let's turn to the book of Genesis 12. Genesis chapter 12. And we're going to meet a man named Abram. And to set it up a little bit, we'll talk about Genesis 11, but we'll just read Genesis 12, verses 1 through 6. But in Genesis 11, we meet the family of Abram, and we find out that he is from a place called Ur of the Chaldees. And we don't know a lot about Ur, but what we do know, we were led to believe that it was a major center. It was the equivalent of Tokyo or London back in that day, or New York. It was a major center. It was as urban as things would have been in that period, an important place. And then at some point along the way, his family decides to move out to the suburbs, if you will. They relocate into a region called Haran. And things are going well. Apparently they're prospering. They're laying down some roots. They're maybe even making some improvements. They're making a home for themselves, this family of Abram. And then God injects himself into the story and changes the trajectory of Abram's life in some really amazing and important ways. Let's begin in chapter 12, verse 1 of Genesis. Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house into a land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless you, and curse them that curse you, and in you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. So Abram departed, as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. And Abram took his wife Sarah, and in Lot his brother's son, and all their substance that they had gathered. Apparently they had great substance. And they had gathered, and all the souls that they had gotten in Haran, and they went forth into the land of Canaan, and into the land of Canaan they came. And this was a fateful moment in Abram's, the one who would become Abraham's life. Because it's interesting, of course, that he heeded God's call. But I want to focus on that right now. I want to focus on that fateful decision, what that meant for Abraham. You know what that meant for Abraham at age 75? Some of you here are that age or near that age. I'm not that age, but I'm old enough now to know that if someone told me right now, get up and move, that would be stressful. And at age 75, he got up and left. And you know what that meant for the next 100 years of his life, he lived to be 175 years old, he never again had a home. He was a nomad for the rest of his long days. He wandered as a foreigner in a foreign land. As an aside, I had the opportunity over the weekend, we flew up to Cincinnati to go visit my grandmother, who will be 100 years old in January. And she's still very lucid, and she's a wonder. She's amazing. So think about, my grandmother was born in 1919. And my children, if I'm blessed to meet some of their children, there's a reasonable expectation, given life expectancies today, that my grandchildren could be alive in the year 2119. So between me will be people that I would be well acquainted with, will be a span of 200 years. That has nothing to do with what I'm talking about today. Just something interesting. Just something interesting to let your mind rattle and roll on that one for a while. And it's amazing when you think about how we're connected. And in some ways, time seems so long, but really not so much. Time is really relatively short. And we look forward to coming back up for my grandmother's 100th birthday in a few months. But back on point, Abraham spent 100 years wandering. And we know that he never put down roots. Don't turn there, but just reference Genesis 23, the story of when he needed to bury Sarah. Remember that story? He didn't have any place to bury his loved one. He had to go to the local leaders, the tribal leaders, and say, please. He said, remember in Genesis 23, verse 4, he said, I'm a stranger, a foreigner in your land. Please sell me a plot to bury Sarah. And they, of course, agreed. But the point being, he didn't own any land. He had no place, no home. Now let's turn to Genesis 47 and see something interesting. Because not only was Abraham's fate to be a nomad, but that was the fate of his descendants. Let's turn to chapter 47 of Genesis. This is one of the most touching scenes of the Bible, because we're going to come now at the end of the story. We know the story of Joseph, who was the son of Jacob, Abraham's grandson. Joseph, of course, was taken into captivity in Egypt, and all these years, Jacob thought Joseph was dead. And he later learns that not only is Joseph alive, he's the prime minister of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh. It's an amazing story, so amazing that Hollywood has made movies about it, and it's just one of those things that is hard to comprehend. And as a great honor at the end of his life, Jacob was given the opportunity to meet Pharaoh. Let's just read about that story, Genesis 47, verse 5. And Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, saying, Thy father and thy brethren are come unto thee, and the land of Egypt is before thee. In the best of the land, make thy father and brethren to dwell in the land of Goshen. In other words, you have a home now for a time. And we know for about 400 years, right, they had this home, so to speak. And if thou should know any man of activity among them, make them rulers over my cattle. And Joseph brought in Jacob his father and set him before Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said unto Jacob, How old are you? And Jacob said unto Pharaoh, The days of my years of my pilgrimage are 130 years, and few and evil have been the days of the years of my life. But they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage. In other words, I've been a pilgrim for 130 years, but that's nothing. You have to add on Abraham's 100-year pilgrimage. You have to add on the decades of Isaac's pilgrimage. This was a pilgrimage that was centuries long, literally. All because of that fateful decision of Abraham to heed God's call and to leave his country and to go on this pilgrimage. It's very interesting to consider. Now, I've mentioned this word pilgrimage. Let's define that. What does that mean? A pilgrimage is just simply a journey or a wandering in a foreign land on your way to a sacred or holy place. People do pilgrimages today, right? In other religions, we do that. In a sense, are we not on a pilgrimage today during this feast? And therefore, a pilgrim, the one who takes the pilgrimage, is, just to define it, a traveler or wanderer in a foreign land. And it was interesting that Jacob described the life of his family, the family of Abraham, as pilgrims on a pilgrimage. Let's go to Hebrews, the 11th chapter, continue this thought. Hebrews 11, we'll read verses 8 through 16 with some breaks, but that'll be the text. Hebrews 11 will begin in verse 8. By faith, Abraham, when he was called to go out into the place which he should after receive for an inheritance, he obeyed. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he sojourned in a land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles or tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. Why? Because he looked for a city which had foundations, whose builder and maker is God. He was on a pilgrimage, a sacred journey to where? To a city whose maker was God. His entire life was a pilgrimage. He viewed it in that context. Let's continue on, but we'll skip down to verse 13. Now, this is, of course, the faith chapter in Hebrews 11, so the writer's referring to others, but specifically now we're referencing Abraham. But in verse 13 it says, "These all died, particularly Abraham, in the faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them from afar off, and they were persuaded by them and embraced them and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For they that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country. And truly, if they had been mindful of that country from whence they came out, they might have had opportunity to have returned. But now they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city." They confessed. What does it mean to confess? It means, in the most literal sense, to make the statement, but it's something more than that. To confess it is to take in deeply of the thought, to live the reality, not just to believe it and say it, but to really do it and believe it. And they confessed that they were pilgrims. And they lived their life with the perspective of a pilgrim, a wanderer. Abram and his descendants, they lived their life from the perspective of a pilgrim. Now, let's not confuse a pilgrim with a term that we use now sometimes, an expatriate. Everyone knows what an expatriate is. An expatriate is someone who's living in another country away from their homeland for a time, but usually by choice. We have an expatriate in the audience today, my wife Tracy, who's Canadian, and she's pleased for the most part to be living in America. She loves America. She's lived here longer than she's lived in Canada, although she loves her country, make no mistake, especially when the hockey teams between U.S. and Canada play. That causes some tension in the house. But other than that, everything's good. But that's not a good example. She's an expatriate, but she's okay with being here. A pilgrim is something different. A pilgrim's desire is not for the country where they are. A pilgrim is something else. A pilgrim is someone who wants to be somewhere else, and by necessity is journeying through a foreign land. That's what Abraham was. Now, Abraham was one of the great heroes of the Bible. You could make some good arguments that other than Jesus Christ himself, maybe Abraham is the greatest hero of the Bible. He had many titles. Think of some of his titles. He was called what? The friend of God in the book of James, right? Abraham was called the father of many nations. Think about Abraham. Some of the descendants of Abraham would include, among others, Moses, right? Jesus Christ, Muhammad. The three great religions trace their ancestry to Abraham. Has there ever lived, in a sense, a more influential, person? When you think about the influence that he and his family have had on world affairs? His life is beyond comprehension, the magnitude of his life. But his most important title is the father of what? The father of the faithful, right? The Christian experience is, by analogy, compared to being grafted into the tree of the family of Israel, right? When we're grafted into the tree of the family of Israel, we're grafted into a tree whose root is whom? Is Abraham, right? So if Abraham is our father in the faith, so to speak, we have to understand what that means. And it means in part that the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. For the Christian life, the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree because we, too, are asked to share in Abraham's fate to some extent. Let's turn to Luke, the 14th chapter. I know it's tough to stay awake. I'm so tempted to just clap real quick, but I won't do that. That's how you become a legend, though. Do things like that, but I'm not looking for legendary status here. Luke 14. Let's read the words of Jesus here. Luke 14, verses 25 through 27. I'm sorry, the guy's trying to put the verses up. I'm not helping them. Luke 14, let's begin in verse 25. And there went great multitudes with him being Jesus Christ. And he turned and said unto them, verse 26, If any man comes to me and hates not his father and mother and wife and children and brethren and sisters, yea, his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoa, let's step back and mull that one over for a moment. Now, we understand that Jesus was a poet in many ways, okay? I think we understand we can't always take Jesus literally, although sometimes we can and probably should more often than we do, but he means what he means here. And what he means here, I think we understand, because this would contradict the rest of the Bible. Obviously, we don't hate our families. But by comparison, our primary allegiance is to God, not even our own physical families. And by extension, what is a tribe or what is a nation? Is it not just a family that's grown large? So by extension, our own allegiance has to be to something other than our own family, our own tribe, our own country. And don't just let that one go right by. We love our country. We shed tears for our country. And it's going to be challenging to keep these things in perspective as we go forward. This was alluded to earlier today. We live in very difficult and challenging times, and we have to keep this in perspective, that when it's all comes out in the wash, whatever cliche you want to use, we have to love less our own family than we love God and Jesus Christ. And that goes all the way up the chain, because again, just our family, a nation is just a family in essence that's grown large. Let's continue on, verse 27. And whosoever does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. This invitation to take up a cross and follow Jesus, does that sound just a little bit like the invitation Abraham received in Genesis? Pick up your stuff and follow me. There's some real similarities there. There's an analogy, and this is what we're asked to do as Christians, to take up our cross. And what's interesting here is each cross is apparently somewhat individualized. Your cross may not look like mine as far as the burdens I'm asked to bear, the challenges I'm asked to face, and vice versa. We are not probably, in most cases, literally asked to leave our homes like Abraham was, although in some cases we will be. But this is what we share in common. In each case, we're asked to leave behind our primary allegiance to our home and to our homeland and to everything else other than Jesus Christ. It's very much, that's where it's analogous. The specifics may look different for each of us. And that's one of the day-to-day challenges, the exciting challenges of becoming a Christian, is to each day try to seek out God's will and what your cross to bear is, and to do that with joy and serenity as much as possible. But what's not distinctive is what we're asked to do is to leave our homes figuratively and to leave our homelands and to point our allegiances in a new direction. So we're asked to live a similar fate as that of Abraham, to go out into the world carrying the cross of Jesus and to live from what I'll call the perspective of a pilgrim. I'd like to read something about perspective. There's an author that's kind of popular these days. His name is Andy Andrews. Some of you may be familiar with him, but his most popular book is a book called The Noticer, and the subtitle is "Sometimes All a Person Needs is a Little Perspective." So I'd like to read what he had to say about perspective. He said, "In desperate times, much more than anything else, folks need perspective, for perspective brings calm. Calm leads to clear thinking. Clear thinking yields new and better ideas, and ideas produce the bloom of an answer. Keep your head and heart clear. Perspective can just as easily be lost as it can be found." And when Abram and his descendants confessed that they were pilgrims, part of that confession was a confession that we are going to approach life from the perspective of a pilgrim. with the clear understanding that we are just strangers passing through. Maybe not literally having to leave our homes, but being willing to having the mindset that we would be willing to do so, and that we have emotionally and in every other way put our allegiances in a new direction, in a different direction. During the feast, we're asked to do this, and in a literal sense, but it's an object lesson, I really believe. And one of the benefits of living in the perspective of a pilgrim is, like Mr. Andrews said so well here, is that it leads to clear thinking. And I can tell you one thing: the church, the world, our neighbors, neighborhoods, every level of society could use today is clear thinking. And having the perspective of a pilgrim leads to clear thinking. Let's talk about that a little bit. In what ways? How would that look? That sounds good, but what does that mean practically? It means many things, but there are at least a couple that I want to focus on. Let's go to 2 Peter. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 through 11. Or, excuse me, 1 Peter. Did I say 2 Peter? Yes. I'm sorry. 1 Peter 2, verses 9 through 11. 1 Peter 2, verse 9. Very familiar scripture to us, describing the church. It says, "You are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, and you should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, which in time past you were not a people, but now you are a people of God." You're a new nation. You have a new family. "Which had not obtained mercy, but now you have obtained mercy. Dearly beloved, I beseech you as what? As strangers and pilgrims. Abstain from fleshly lust, which what? Which war against your soul." These fleshly lusts, these earthly desires, they're not just distractions. They're not just something that wastes our time. They're much worse than that. They war against our very soul. If we had to pick one word that would define fleshly lust, what would that be? Don't call out, just maybe unless the Spirit moves you. I guess I wouldn't want to be stifling the Spirit. But short of that, just think it over. What would be one word that would sort of define fleshly lust, and in a big sense? And I'll tell you what I came up with. The word I kept coming back to was materialism. And materialism kind of encompasses all of it. When we hear the word lust, we tend to think, in a certain direction, but materialism takes care of all of it. And here's the definition of materialism right out of the dictionary. Materialism is a tendency to consider material possessions and physical comfort as more important than what? Spiritual values. To consider things and what I want for comfort is more important than spiritual values. That's materialism. I won't even waste your time to try to convince you that materialism defines the spirit of our age. It goes without saying. We can just move on. We can stipulate it, as lawyers like to say. And it wars against our souls. And to think that we have not been influenced by it would be naive at best. Maybe at worst, willfully ignorant. But understand that we are in a war against materialism. I got to know the son of a very wealthy man one time who told me that he had been very successful in real estate development, the father of the son. And the son said his dad had an expression that he would tell him all the time. And he said, "Son, don't fall in love with things that can't love you back." And I think what the dad meant in that sense was when you're making business decisions, don't get emotional about it. Keep emotions out of your business decisions. But in the broader context, it still makes sense. You want to be very careful that if we place too much importance on things that can't love you back, and what cannot ever love you back? Material things, right? We were leaving the house the other day to come here, and we were in the car and driving away, and my daughter Chelsea, the cute blonde one back there in the middle, she said, "Dad, do we remember to lock the doors?" And I immediately said, "I'm not worried about it. I have everything in this car I care about." I said, "I got my computer right there in the back." And And she gets me, okay? She gets my sense of humor. She understood. But I was kidding, of course, because that, of course, is true. I don't really leave the doors unlocked. I mean, anything that's important is in this car right now. And we have to take that mindset and extrapolate it into all aspects of our lives, that materialism is killing our society, and if we're not careful, it will kill our souls. We're warned of that. 2 Peter, all these millennium back, said those things. And nothing's new under the sun. I think what may be new is the degree. Not the thing, but the degree, I suspect, is somewhat new. Let's turn to Matthew 6. When we live with the perspective of a pilgrim, there will be less materialism. We'll be less materialistic. And from that will flow clear thinking. Let's turn to Matthew 6. Actually, we'll be in Matthew 6 for a while. We'll start in verse 19, but maybe just, I'm going to skip around, but maybe just put Matthew 19 in the rest of the chapter up there. Unless that's too long. I don't know if you're able to do that, but we'll start in Matthew 6, 19 through 21. If I can ever get there. Let's begin in verse 19, Matthew 6. Jesus, the words of Jesus says, "Lay not up for yourself treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust does corrupt, nor where thieves do break through nor steal." In other words, anything material can be stolen or can decay. That was we talked about earlier. "For where your treasure is," verse 21, "that is where your heart will be also." Be willing to live as a pilgrim, knowing that anything I can carry with me along the way, other than my children, maybe a beloved pet, if it can't love you back, it's not worth too much of our attention ultimately. And that's perspective. That's the perspective of a pilgrim. Don't love things that can't love you back. Now, I want to just throw in a little sidebar here. Because I was a young person, as hard as that is to believe, I was once the age of my kids sitting in sermons much like this. They were much less interesting and charismatically delivered, of course. But in many ways were like this. That wasn't intended as a joke. I'm sorry, you guys. You really misunderstand me, apparently. We're not connecting. We're missing. That's fine. But if you're like me, you would think, oh, are you telling me my life has to be boring and unsuccessful and I have to kind of go move away to a compound or whatever? No, I'm not saying any of that. Think about who the hero of this story is. I started with Abraham. You know who Abraham was? He was a man that when he needed to could summon his own personal 300-man army to go save Lot. Abraham had some means. Abraham prospered. Being a pilgrim doesn't mean you don't necessarily prosper or have influence or succeed. I'm not here today, young people, I'm talking to you now, to define your dreams, limit your dreams, or tell you what you can or cannot do. You can do whatever your talents, your energy, and God's will take you. I'm not here to limit you in any way. I'm simply here to ask you, wherever God leads you, whatever dreams you may have, that you do it with the perspective of a pilgrim, that you keep it in a perspective. That what we do ultimately for God and the benefit secondarily perhaps of our families. Not for material gain, which wars against our souls. So please don't misunderstand what I'm saying, and hopefully you don't. You know, another example, I just think of David. What did David say in Psalm 119? He said, I'm a stranger. He said, I'm a pilgrim. And he's David, okay, the slayer of Goliath, okay? No one here is to throw water on anything that your hopes and your dreams. We're just simply I'm asking you to do it within a perspective, to keep perspective, the perspective of a pilgrim. So that's one of the ideas of being a pilgrim, is that we, over time, will be less materialistic. Well, then that will lead to clearer thinking. And another perspective, let's continue on in another thing that would be characterize the perspective of a pilgrim. Let's continue on in Matthew 6. Let's go down to verse 25. We'll read verses 25 through 33. Matthew 25, we should already be in Matthew 6, so it's verse 25, Matthew 6. It says, "Therefore I say unto you, take no thought for your life, what you shall eat or what you shall drink, nor yet for your body what you shall put on. Is not the life more than meat, and the body than raiment? Behold the fowls of the air, for they sow not, neither do they reap, nor gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feedeth them. And are you not much better than they? Which of you by taking one thought can add 1 cubit to his stature? And why take you thought for raiment, for clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow, and how they toil not, neither do they spin. And yet I say to you that even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Wherefore, if God so clothe the grass of the field, which today is and tomorrow is cast into the oven, shall not he also much more clothe you, you of little faith? Therefore take no anxious thought, saying, what shall we eat, what shall we drink, or wherewithal shall we be clothed? For all these things the Gentiles seek, for your heavenly Father knows you need these things. But seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you." I've got sort of my own sort of vision of what it'll be like when I meet Jesus for the first time, face to face. I'm reminded of the song, will I dance, will I cry, what will I do? I don't know. But I also have this sense that Jesus may look at me and he'll speak to me in the tone that boys who played, or men who played high school sports together tend to talk to one another this way. They give each other a hard time, and he's going to look at me and wink and say, "Richard, what part of don't worry did you not understand, you knucklehead?" But he's going to do it with a gleam in his eye, right? And I'd like to ask all of us, what part of don't be anxious do we not understand? You know? And please, I'm the worst offender. If someone's preaching, you can guarantee they're preaching it themselves. Just be assured of it. That's why it's coming up. And if it's something I'm fighting with, I know that you are too. We live in an age designed, I think, to some extent to make us fearful, to make us anxious. But with the perspective of a pilgrim, we don't need to be. Why? Well, simply put, because all the big questions have been answered. Anything that really matters, any question that ultimately matters in the scheme of things is answered. Let's go to Philippians 4. Philippians 4, we'll read verses 4 through 8. I'll make it easier for you guys there as we go. If this is not my favorite passage of Scripture, it's near the top for sure. Let's begin in Philippians 4, verse 4. It says, "Rejoice in the Lord always." Again, I say rejoice. You know, laughter is good for the soul, just as an aside. It's a good thing to laugh. I hope we can have some laughs this week. "Let your moderation be known unto all men. The Lord is at hand. Let your clear thinking, your perspective be known to all men," if I could paraphrase. But here's the kicker, though, in verse 6. "Be anxious or fearful for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, shall keep your hearts and your minds through Jesus Christ." Be anxious for nothing. What part of don't worry did you not understand? Now, the ability to live with less fear, or to live fearless, and by the way, that will never probably occur in the flesh. I don't want to give you false hope here, but we certainly can minimize that in our lives, and largely I think it's a gift of God through his Spirit, that we become less fearful as we better understand God's way and as we live as pilgrims. But we have a part to play. Let's look in verse 8. Good mental habits do play a role in this. Verse 8 says, "Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatever things are honest, and whatever things are just and pure and lovely and positive, of good report, if there be any virtue, meditate on these things." And I can offer you one thing to meditate on this week, and that is that whatever we're experiencing now is temporary. And it's all leading to something much better because we're pilgrims. The novel Great Gatsby, a lot of people still read that in school today, and during one part, the main character says, he's a very famous quote, he says, "Let me tell you about the very rich." He says, "They're not like the rest of us." And that brings to mind a story of a friend of mine who's my best friend from law school. And his parents, I've never met, his mother and his stepfather, about 15 years ago, were huge winners in the lottery. I mean, millions. And they elected, when they won the lottery, they elected the way that you get paid, not in a lump sum, but you get paid, By the way, elect the lump sum. Anybody play the lottery here? No, I'm just kidding. Do not raise your hand if I had, but economically, you're usually better off with the lump sum, but that's another topic. But they elected to take the yearly payments. And I've heard my friend tell me stories of how they live. They lived very modest means. In fact, they were not exactly poor, but they were flirting with that most of their lives. And he said once they won the lottery, they bought this huge RV. They take vacations and they live it up all year. And the way they live is that they spend all their money all year going to debt, and then when the check comes at the end of the year, they pay it off and start over. And he says they have the most fun. They party. They're just fun all the time. And at least on a very superficial level, you can understand why. Because they understand no matter what occurs, short of a physical illness, but as far as any other challenges, paying the rent, paying for the vacation, sending a grandkid to college, the check's coming. Right? So all of a sudden, their perspective is so different. The rich aren't like you and me, Well, I'm here to offer you today that we are wealthy, that we're sitting on the winning lottery ticket. And that's so basic, but I would propose to you that if we meditated on that regularly, that you were sitting on that winning lottery ticket, because to use the example of my dad, he's one of these guys that has to record the games and then see who wins. If his team wins, then he'll watch the game, right? John Beasley knows what I'm talking about. Yeah, okay. Well, George Crow is the same way. Well, let me tell you, this is not the first time you've heard someone from the pulpit say this, but I've watched the end of the game, and we win. And we win big. It's not even close. Don't doubt me on that. Live in that perspective, and there'll be less fear. And that's the perspective of a pilgrim, less materialistic and less fear. Let's conclude in the book of Philippians. Again, just turn over a page to chapter 3, verses 17 through 20. Now, the writer of this book was Paul, as we know, and Paul could tell you a few things about living as a pilgrim. Paul's life is like a disaster movie. The things he experienced, the pain, the suffering, and yet he was able to write these beautiful and encouraging words that we're about to read now. Let's go to verse 17. It says, "Brethren, be followers together of me, and mark them which walk as ye have walked for an example." And part of Paul's example was to be able to keep a positive perspective through many hardships. Verse 18, "For many walk, of whom I have told you often, and now tell you, even weeping, that they are enemies of the cross." Now, actually, I don't want to read this other translation here. "Who set their mind on earthly things," verse 20. "For our citizenship is in heaven, from which we so eagerly wait for the Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, who will transform our lowly body that it may be conformed to his glorious body, according to the working by which he is able even to subdue all things to himself." That's how we win, because our citizenship is not of this world. We don't have a homeland. We're pilgrims, we're wanderers. And let's keep the perspective of a pilgrim. And let's let this time during the feast be a reminder to us as we sort of have an object lesson in what it means to be pilgrims, to live in temporary dwellings, to leave our homes. And let us look forward to that great city on a hill whose builder is God. Enjoy the rest of your feast, and thank you so much for this opportunity.